Hello and welcome to part 4 of the DazToHue tutorial series. In the previous video we exported our character out of Houdini, ready for us to import into Unreal Engine. As I was editing the previous video, I realized that at one point I had disabled occlusion culling. I think it was when I was showing the UV layouts when we were going through the materials, and I forgot to turn it back on. But now that I'm thinking about it further, this character is going to be our base character, our base resolution character. It will be LOD 0 in other words. So what I'm thinking now is I might actually export it originally without any poly reductions applied at a higher, at this higher resolution, and then we'll come back and have a bit of a look at how we can create other LOD levels for this character. So I'm just quickly going to go to the mesh node and disable these poly reduction operations. We'll, however, turn occlusion culling back on because, even though this is our high resolution character, we're still not going to be able to see the body underneath, so there's no point having it. Let's make sure that's, just select the occlusion node. I'll just make sure that's still being occluded, which it is. So with that done, I'm just going to quickly re-export our character. Other than that, everything else is the same as what we had before. So we'll just hit export again. It should be a little quicker this time because, as I say, we're not doing any poly reductions or mesh changes other than that occlusion culling. So you remember last time it took, I think it was around a little over 82 seconds from memory. So this time it's taken pretty much 27 seconds. So yeah, it's a little quicker without those mesh operations being applied. So we still have the 4 files that we exported. Our character file, our pose asset names, JCM methods, and our simple arms up animation that we've retargeted onto this skeleton. Now I'm just going to minimize Houdini and jump over to Unreal Engine. So here we are inside just a dev project I have in Unreal Engine. I've got a few characters I've been experimenting with. I've just created a new folder for Michael 8, which is the character we're working on now, and I've set up the materials for this character, just following my usual material creation process for Genesis 8 characters. And obviously I've imported the textures that I need for this character. And here's that body texture I told you about in the previous episode, where I've basically created a texture atlas out of the head, body, arms, and legs, as well as the finger and toenails. Now, because I named my character in Houdini Michael 8 and I stuck with my mi underscore material instance prefix, Unreal Engine should automatically discover these materials and assign them to the character on import. So the mesh and the pose folder are blank at the moment. So to import our character, I'm just going to right click on my meshes folder here and select the import option. We want to import this Michael 8 FBX character. I'll just wait for the import options to appear. I'll reset them back to default and we can just have a quick look at them. So the options I typically go with, I use T0 as reference pose. We do want to import morph targets because we do have morphs applied to the character. I'm not going to import LODs at this time. Now, one option to keep an eye out for is this morph threshold position. This is basically the cutoff for whether or not Unreal Engine will import a morph target or not. If the changes of the vertex positions once the morph target is applied is below this threshold, then Unreal Engine will skip it. So you might recall way back in part 2 of this series, where we were setting up a range of motion animation, I talked a bit about scenarios where you may not need a corrective morph because the visual difference of having them or not was pretty much unnoticeable. So in that scenario, you have 2 options. The quick and dirty way is to just lower this number, which is what I'm going to do in this case. Although I think with our current range of motion, the default value would be fine. It would still import all of the morph targets. But perhaps the better way of dealing with this scenario, if you encounter it, would be to go back and reevaluate your range of motion animation and potentially remove the morphs that don't meet this original threshold, because realistically they're going to be so insignificant anyway in terms of the visual outcome. There is a slight performance cost to having them. In this case, I'm not going to create a physical asset. I am, however, going to import animations because there is an animation track with our character file. Specifically, it's our range of motion animation, but it also has the keyframes for each of the morphs applied to it. We'll have a look at what that looks like in a little bit. I think the only other thing I'm going to change is the search location for materials. As I say, I've set up my materials for this character already. If I just change that to search under parent, it should auto-discover them. I'm certainly going to tell it to not create the materials if it doesn't discover them, nor import the textures. That's just my preference for the way I work. I don't like it automatically importing the textures. I tend to process them a bit myself anyway. So with those options set, I'm just going to click the Import All button, wait for it to import, and this takes a few seconds on my machine. Okay, so that's finished importing. We don't have any errors, which is good to see. We always get this smoothing group warning for just about any FBX I've imported, so I disregard that. It doesn't seem to mean anything. So we can see the 3 files that it's brought in for us. If we start with we'll start with the mesh. Oops, set to wireframe. I'll just put it back to lit node. So we can see that it has auto-discovered our materials that I set up. If we have a look at wireframe quickly, we can see it is our high poly mesh, but occlusion was applied, so we don't have the body underneath the shirt or any of the clothing. We can see on the right here that it has brought in our corrective morphs. These always look weird when you apply them without joint rotations, but you can really see that they are there and appear to be working correctly. If we have a look at the material slots, we can see the 7 materials that we defined in Houdini. If we isolate the body, again, we can just make sure all that occlusion culling worked. Now, the first things I usually change once I've brought a character in, under these sections, so under LOD 0 sections, some of you probably already know that with Unreal Engine, if you apply morphs, particularly morphs that change vertex positions quite a bit, you can get some shading errors when their morphs are applied. And the way to address that is to use these recompute tangents options. You only need to apply this for parts of the character that do get morphs applied to it. So in our case, the clothing will definitely be one of those. So under recompute tangents, I'm just going to select red. Now this takes it again a few seconds to update. And I'm also going to apply it to the face because we do have some facial morphs. And although we didn't create any morphs for the arms or fingers specifically for this simple tutorial, normally I would also apply this setting for the body as well. So once that's done, I'll save the mesh again just to make sure. So I think that's all we need to look at the moment for our skeletal mesh. Just quickly, we'll have a look at the skeleton as well. Turn on all bones in hierarchy. So you can see it's brought in our skeleton with the names being auto-renamed to match the Manny skeleton. Now, it's important to note that it's not exact one-for-one match with the Mani-skeleton. The reason being that the Mani-skeleton in Unreal Engine 5 actually has a 5th spine bone, whereas DAZ Genesis 8, for example, only has the 4 spine bones. So like I say, it's not an exact one-for-one match, but it is very close. All the names align, and it makes things like retargeting onto this skeleton much easier, having all the bone names already matching. And the other file that's brought in is our range of motion animation. This looks a little odd when it's flying through that. So what I'll do is turn off the bones again, so you don't need to see those anymore. What you can see here is it is our range of motion animation that we set up in Daz and processed in Houdini. Oddly, there's no option to just step from frame to frame in Unreal Engine, at least not that I could find. It interpolates even between frame 0 and 1, which I've always found a little odd, but it's just the way it works. But if we were to land on, say, frame 1 approximately, you can see our Mani pose, our T pose, and then we go into our foot down, foot up, calf forward, back, etc. You'll notice here that there is a key for the frame where each of the joint corrective morphs has been applied. The effect of that is, if you look at a particular frame, you will see it with the corrective morphs being applied, not just the linear skinned version. If we have a look at the face towards the end of our range of motion where we started defining our expressions, we've got rage and happy, and then our speech shapes, just the two we put at the end. Now, one of the things you can do, and again it's a personal preference to some degree, what I typically do under this create assets option up top here, we go to create pose asset and we can use the current animation. In this case I'm just going to export the whole animation as a pose asset. You might want to break this up into separate pose assets for example, the retargeting poses, the JCM portion, the expressions and the speech. That's up to you, but for now I'm just going to create a pose asset out of the whole animation. It's just asking me where I want to put it and what I want to call it. In this case I'll just call it PA for pose asset, and I'll just call it Michael 8. So it's created the pose assets out of that animation, but it hasn't given the names that we want for each of the pose assets. And that's where this pose asset name file that Houdini exported for us comes in handy, because what we can do is just open that, select everything and copy, come back to Unreal Engine, and if you right click at the top here and just say paste all pose names and then save, you can see now that each of the poses has the correct name for it. So that's a quick look at the files that it's imported. What I thought I might show now is how we can go about applying another LOD level to our character. So if we jump back into the character mesh, we can see under LODs, LOD settings, we only have the one LOD at the moment, and that's our base LOD. But we do get the option to import an LOD level 1. We just need to create it first. So that's what we'll do now, just as a quick example. So we jump back to Houdini. Now the way I'm about to show you is, I guess, the current way of creating LODs in the DazToHue workflow. I would like to revisit this at some point and perhaps create a more streamlined approach to it, but the way I'm about to show you is probably the Houdini way of doing things, which is all around creating a tree of nodes. So the way I'm going to do it, if I'm going to take my skin node here, set the display flag to that, and then I'm going to select all the nodes, including it, down. So we're just left with our import and skeleton node unselected. I'm going to hit Control C to copy, then Control V to paste. It's going to think for a little bit. Now what we have is a separate branch to our node network, and it's split from the skeleton node down. So this first branch will be our LOD0, which we've already exported. Unfortunately, because I changed that, it does want to recook the corrective morphs, which is a bit of a pain. I haven't yet worked out how to get around that if it's possible. And the end of this second branch is going to be LOD1. Now we're just going to work on this second LOD1 branch here to create a lower poly version of our character, and we're going to use that to become our LOD1 in Unreal Engine. Again, it's really up to you what you want to change for your LOD1 character. You could obviously go back and change anything on these nodes. You could consolidate the shapes into a single shape rather than having two. You could further adjust the occlusion culling to cull more of the character, although in this case that's not necessary. What we will do, however, is use our mesh operations to perform poly reductions on the character. So it's remembered the settings from the last time we set this up. So at the moment it's just performing poly reductions on the clothing. It's just using the default options, and I'm going to leave it at that because that does a pretty good job. But what I also want to do now is do some poly reduction on the character's body itself. Knowing that this character will be viewed from a distance, our LOD1 will anyway. We don't need that much detail in the mesh, so we can reduce the character's body a little bit and still probably get away with it. What we want to try and do is keep a good silhouette. What I'm going to do is create another poly reduction operation. And we are going to perform it on the entire character. Sorry, the character's body, excluding the clothing, that is. So you can see now it's applied it to our character's body with just the default options again. Even though it's probably not necessary in this case, I do want to, I guess, show some of the options we have for preserving detail in parts of the face. So say, for example, if I turn off this continuous reduction and we decide we want to really aggressively reduce the character's body as much as we can. We might even go a little further, maybe down to 12%. What you can see now is, the general outline of the body is still pretty good, the arms, etc. But things like the mouth and the ears are starting to get a bit junky looking. That's simply because there's not enough polygons in that area to capture that detail. Fingertips is also another area that sometimes happens. So what I want to show quickly is how we can use Houdini, some of the built-in tools of Houdini to address that. So what I'm going to do is just drag my mesh node down a bit to create a bit of space. And I'm also just going to switch to the FBX character view. It might just speed things up a bit if we're only looking at the FBX and not the Alembic as well. So what we want to do here is be able to paint on the mesh the areas that we want to retain more polygons. And it's going to use that to drive the poly reduction node. So if we have a look at the connections between each of the nodes, you'll notice every node has 4 inputs and 4 outputs. The first input is the FBX skin, the second is its skeleton, the third is its animation, and the fourth is the Alembic cache. So what we basically want to do is paint on the FBX skin the areas that we want to. So if I right click or hit the tab key and just type in paint, we're going to select this attribute paint node. Now we're going to connect our FBX skin to it and connect its output back into the mesh node. Now on the attribute paint node, I'm just going to turn on enable mirroring. Just do the left and right, the one stroke. And under the attributes, we need to give it a name. Now it doesn't really matter what the name is, providing it's not already in use somewhere else. In this case, I'm just going to call it retain because it's about retaining parts of the mesh. Now, if you hover over the viewport and click enter, you'll enter paint mode. You can see the options that you have on the left here. I'm going to use the scroll wheel just to bring down. Sorry, the other thing we want to do is set the display flag on the actual attribute paint node as well, which makes it a bit cleaner. So use the scroll wheel to adjust the brush size. I'm just going to start painting around parts of the character's face where I want to try and retain some of that mesh detail. With the nose and also the mouth. If I hold down shift, I can smooth that out a little bit. While I'm here, I might also paint the ears. Okay, and we'll smooth that out a little bit. And just for fun, we'll do the fingertips as well. Don't have to be too precise for this. If you hold down Control and Paint, you can remove areas that you've painted. I think that'll do for this example. Because we had symmetry on, it's already done the other side. So now if I hit Escape to get out of the attribute paint view, what we now have on our geometry is this retain attribute for every point on the geometry. And each point will have a value of how much of this attribute was applied. However, if you recall earlier on in the tutorial series, I did talk a lot about the fact that we always need to make sure that our FBX our FBX skin and our alembic cache remain in sync. So if I just turn the default view back on to bring back our alembic part. So at the moment, only our FBX skin knows about the attribute we just painted. The alembic cache doesn't have that attribute applied to it. But because of the work that the skin node did, the two meshes are identical, which means we can very easily transfer any attributes from one to the other. So that's what I'll do now. Again, if I right click, and this time I'll type in copy, and we're going to select this attribute copy node. Now it's asking for the the geometry to copy the attributes to. In this case, it's going to be our alembic cache stream. And again, we're going to plug that into the mesh node. Now it also wants to know where we're copying it from. So in this case, it's going to be the attribute paint node that we just used to paint that attribute onto the FBX skin. Now, if we have a look at the options for the copy node, by default it's set to color. So we don't want to copy the color. What we want to copy is this retain attribute that we just created. So I'm going to select that. This is a point attribute, so the group type should be point, or it is already. We don't need to copy local variables. So now at this stage, both the FBX skin and the alembic cache have that retain attribute applied to them. So what we're going to do now is jump back to our mesh node, scroll down to our reduction operation that we're performing on the character's clothing. And right down the bottom of that, we have these two options that are dealing with preserving parts of the mesh that we want to retain some detail around. And before we get to the paint operation, this retain density by attribute, which is ultimately what we're going to do, I'll just quickly show you what the soft edges option can do. So with the soft edges option, what you can do is select again parts of the character based on the groups available to retain detail around. So if, for example, I selected the character's lips, wait for that to process. You can see now it has preserved more detail in the character's lips. But it's important to know that that is at the expense of other areas of the character. So, we've told it we want to try and keep 12% of the original polygon counts. Any options below that will be primarily concerned with how it divvies up those polygons between the different areas of the mesh. So the more we tell it to add detail to the face, the less detail there will be in other parts of the character, unless we give it more of a polygon budget to work with. There is this soft edge weight option, which we can increase to tell it that we really want to keep a lot of detail in the character's lips, for example. You can see now we now have more polygons in the lips, but again there'll be fewer elsewhere. And you can add to this soft edge group. So let's say we want to, well, as a good example actually, what we could do is just tell it that we want to retain the entire face. If I select face, wait for it to process, you can see now we have a lot more geometry in the face. The lips is a separate piece of geometry, so we will bring the lips back as well. But you can see now it's really struggling because it's putting all of its polygon budget in the face, and it's not leaving enough for the other parts of the character's body. You can start to see some artifacts, some UV seams being torn in various places. Now you have a couple of options if you wanted to stick with the soft edges approach. Obviously we could reduce it and something like 2, and it'll free up some of those polygons for use elsewhere on the character. Probably go a bit less even. And we might want to also capture the ears. So overall that did a pretty good job. We certainly have a lot of polygons in the face for a LOD 1. It's got a nice silhouette even from a distance. I can't see any particular visual artifacts in terms of UV splitting. The ear looks a bit janky, but again at a distance might not be too bad. So that's the soft edges feature. To be honest, it's pretty rare that I've used it, at least so far. I tend to use the attribute paint, or the retain by density attribute option, as it gives me more control over exactly where I want to retain mesh density. So let's have a quick look at that now. So previously we painted the retain attribute onto the FBX skin, and we copied it also over to the Alembic cache. So now what we can do under our mesh node is turn it on. So we'll enable this retain density by attribute option. It's asking for the attribute that we want to use to drive it. In this case, it's our retain attribute. Now you can see it has changed things. There's slightly more detail in the face than there was without the attribute, but we really want to play around with this weight option. So what we'll be doing pretty much is going back and forth between the weight of the retain density attribute and also our overall polygon budget to get that right balance. So I'm going to increase this to something like 4. So I want a little bit more detail in the face. Having this detail in the face, even though it's an LOD version of the character, if for example we still wanted the mouth to open properly and the eyes to sort of show any sort of real expression at a distance, we're going to want a bit more geometry around the face just to capture those deformations properly. All right, so I'm pretty happy with the number of polygons in the areas I've painted. However, we're not left with enough overall. we are seeing some visual artifacts. So what I will do is increase our overall polygon budget. Let's try something like 20. Again, we can keep an eye on the total primitives up here. Just added a little over 3,000 to it. Just going to have a quick look. You know, this isn't perfect. You could spend more time on this, you know, getting this exactly right. But I think for now, I'm pretty happy with that. I've got a lot of detail in the parts of the face that really deform. We also got the ears, although they're arguably not necessary. And we have the rest of the character looking pretty good, at least from a silhouette point of view. We also told it to keep some detail in the fingertips, which it has done. It's more of an example than anything else, but you get the idea. So overall, I'm happy with this. You know, we've brought down the total polygon count considerably from what our LOD0 was. Now you could keep going. You could optimize the materials for your LOD1 version, and normally you would in a real production environment. At some point, at some LOD level, you would probably just create a single texture material to capture everything. But I'm not going to do that for the purposes of this tutorial. This is just an example. But I just wanted to point out that yes, you could, you know, for LOD 1, 2, 3, etc., continually reduce the number of materials and textures required. You know, particularly for things like eyes. You know, you probably don't need Unreal Engine's fancy eye shaders. You know, when the eyes are potentially, you know, that small on screen. But for now, I'll leave that. Pose assets, I'm also going to leave the same. You could, you know, you could refine these for each LOD. You know, for example, you might only want to have the calf bend back morphs generated for this LOD1 version. You almost certainly probably wouldn't want any sort of the real high fidelity, you know, finger corrective morphs if you had them when your character's only sort of this size on screen. It's probably unnecessary. But again, for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to leave those. So now we're going to export our LOD1 version out. And what I'm going to do with this file name suffix field is just put in underscore LOD1. That will be applied to the file names it exports out, just so we don't override our original version. I'm just going to bring up our export directory. We've still got our original files in there. And because I haven't changed any of the corrective morphs or any of that sort of thing, I don't need JCM methods. I don't need the pose asset names. I also don't need that additional animation. But I just realized I didn't bring into Unreal Engine, so we'll have a look at that as well. All I need in this case is the character. So I'm going to export with those new poly reduction operations applied. This will take a little longer because it is doing quite a lot in terms of mesh topology changes. It's also, again, generating the corrective morphs again, but it's generating them for this new topology. Okay, so that's finished exporting. You can see here it took almost 88 seconds. If we take a quick look at the export directory, we can see now that we have our mycolate LOD_1 FBX file, which is what we just exported. So now we'll jump back over to Unreal Engine. If we open our mesh again, we come down to LOD import. We can import LOD level 1. And we select that file we just exported. Wait for it to do its thing. So that's finished. Now, if we have a look at this LOD part on the debug view up here, we scroll, zoom out, sorry, at some point, like here for example, it's swapped to our poly reduced version of the character. So the transition's happening around here. You can see it's pretty seamless. Turn on wireframe view to get another idea. So at the moment it's our high poly character, and we're swapping to our low poly character. To control where that transition happens, LOD picker, if we now pick LOD 1, And under the LOD info section, we want to look at this screen size, which is basically saying how large on screen does this character have to be for this transition to take place. So just an example, I'm going to tell it to transition earlier than it has been. So, sorry, I'll go back to LOD auto so that it actually applies them. So here now we are still on our high res LOD 0. Zoom back slowly. So here's where we've transitioned to the LOD 1 version. Now at this size, this distance, you can see a tiny bit of shading issues on that sleeve there if you go back and forth between them. But again, it's pretty good even at this distance. You can see also we're going from some 285,000 vertices on our high-res character down to just a little over 18,000 on our low-res version. It's a huge savings. And as I say, you could spend more time really getting those LOD topology changes perfect. We'll just have a quick look at the character from side on. And we'll zoom out till that transition occurs, which is just there. That's the high res, low res. So again, if you look closely, you can see obviously some differences, some shading differences. But for such an aggressive reduction in poly count, it's done a pretty good job. So that's how to create and import LODs for your character. I'm going to leave it with just the two LOD groups, so our LOD 0 high res and our LOD 1 low res. Just going to save that again, close that. Now the other thing that's left to do is take a look at that retargeted animation that we exported out of Houdini. What I might do is create a folder, call it animations. Right click that, import. This time we're going to pick our retargeted arms up animation. The skeleton will be our Michael 8 skeleton. Everything else I'm going to leave the same. I'm just going to import that. Now again, this is a ridiculously simple animation. Don't expect too much, but it just demonstrates that the retargeting that happened inside of Houdini has worked. So if we open that up, ta-da! That's what we have. Like I say, it's purely to demonstrate the fact that we could get that retargeting to work in Houdini onto our new character skeleton. So if you are crazy enough to enjoy animating in DazToHue, it is possible to transfer those animations onto this new character in Unreal Engine. So we're going to leave it there for this particular video, and really that covers the core of the DazToHue workflow to date. In a later video, we might look at how to set up our post-animation blueprints to drive the corrective morphs that our character has. But it's not really part of the DazToHue, I guess, workflow itself. The DazToHue part of it was, its job was to process this character and optimize it as much as possible, and do some other things around corrective morph generation and that sort of thing. How you use it, how you use its output is pretty much up to you. But it is something I would like to come back and explore down the track, how we actually apply some of these morphs. And it's an area I'm hoping that as a community we can sort of start to share insights. There's not a whole lot of documentation on things like the pose driver node in Unreal Engine, or even pose assets in general. There's very little documentation around, and the little I've learnt so far has all been through trial and error. But I haven't spent a whole lot of time on it yet, and that's probably what I'm going to focus on next. So with that, we'll leave it there, and I'll see you in the next part. Bye.